Assalamu alaikum to all our viewers, and especially to Dr. Francisco José Luis, dear friend and very learned person and former professor at Habib University. But I think if I can welcome you, Dr. Jose, and also ask you to please introduce yourself to the audience before you start your presentation of the role of Hazrat Ali in Islamic culture and art. Bismillah.
Sure. وعليكم السلام. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على الشمس وجود العالمين حضرت محمد المصطفى وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين وعلى أوليائهم أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Dr. Fransisco José Luis. I'm a Luxembourgish citizen, although I'm actually Portuguese in terms of my origins. My parents migrated to Luxembourg in the middle of the 1970s, so I grew up in Luxembourg. But yes, I developed an interest in two great civilizations right from like in my teenage years, so Islamic civilization and the world of the dharmic religions, be it Buddhism or what is commonly known as Hinduism, although I like to believe that it's more accurate to talk about Hindu religions. After having a class, I went to a classical lycée, so where I had opportunity of having a firm grasp of Latin for a good 6 years before going to university. So I went to the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, where I did two separate master degrees, so one in French and comparative literature and the other one in Indo-Iranian studies. I did that because what really fascinates me, it's the interaction between the Islamic world and the world of the dharmic traditions. So I actually specialized, so I later on went to London to do my PhD at the School of Oriental and African Studies, and I did a study of, so my PhD was about the pre-reformist Sikhism. So Sikhism before the Great Reform of 1925, when the reformist Sikhs forcibly took over the Sikh institutions, a bit like the Soviet Revolution. And actually there are some ties between both events, and radically changed the Sikh tradition by imposing a new theology and a new way of living the tradition. So what I was interested in was pre-reformist Sikhism, which has not been studied very well in academia. And also because it requires actually a great deal of linguistic skills. A lot of the writings are in Sanskrit or in Braj Bhasha, some of them are in Persian. And thank God, I had really good teachers who gave me the tools to be able to do that. And I was really able to discover a world that was so different from reformist Sikhism, and understand the dynamics in which British colonialism impacted the religious landscape in South Asia. And of course, this impact didn't just concern Sikhism, but it also concerned South Asian Islam, as well as the other religious traditions of South Asia, such as Buddhism or Hinduism. So I taught at the University of London for whilst I was doing my PhD. I also taught Punjabi for a couple of years, believe it or not. I actually spent some time in Punjab in order to do my research, and whilst I was living in London, I was sort of adopted by the Sikh community. I actually grew my hair for all of those years. I was wearing the turban, kirpan, and everything. I was proper Sardarji, and so that was quite an interesting experience. And so I later on, so I went back to Luxembourg to teach French in the school, in the secondary school where I did my secondary schooling. And then after completing my PhD, I taught at the University of Toronto for a couple of years. And then I moved to Iran for a year to do research, but also to improve my Farsi. And then I taught in Karachi for 2.5 years, and now I presently live in Baghdad. I moved to Baghdad because, I got married to a wonderful Iraqi lady, and so I recently finished the translation of a very important book about Imam Ali, written by the leading academic in Shi'i studies in the West, Professor Muhammad Ali Amir, who is one of the great successors of Professor Henri Corbin at the chair of Islamic Studies at the Sorbonne, to be more precise, at the École Pratique des Hautes Études. The book's name is Ali, the Well-Guarded Secret, and it deals with the figure of Imam Ali as a vehicle for mystical doctrines and philosophical speculations as well. So it's not so much about the historical character, but rather the figure beyond history. As for myself, I'm presently working on the use of lucid dreams in Islamic spirituality. And I'm focusing in particular on a 19th century work by a Shi'i muhaddith from the city of Najaf, although he's Iranian by origin, by the name of Mirza Nuri Tabarsi, who wrote a 4-volume encyclopedia on visionary dreaming in Islam. And the methods that he describes in order to see the Imams and the Prophet, as well as other holy characters in the dream world, corresponds almost to the letter to similar practices that exist in Tibetan Buddhism, namely dream yoga, where you become aware that you're dreaming within the dream, and this enables you to explore your consciousness, also to go into your subconscious and heal from past trauma, but also enter what we would call the alam al-mithal, and meet prophets and imams and holy people who can give us teachings beyond the grave. And so I'm really interested in the practice itself, but also I'm exploring the possibility of a historical link between Tibetan dream yoga and then the Islamic the practice, because it seems to really go back all the way down to the Prophet. We do have hadith where the Prophet says that my eyes are asleep, but my heart is awake, which is a clear reference to lucid dreaming. So I'm exploring the historical link between the two traditions, and hopefully create a platform where spiritual Islam and Tibetan Buddhism can have a conversation. Recently, Reza Shah Kazemi had brought about this excellent edited volume, I think called Common Grounds, a dialogue between Buddhism and Islam. And I think it's a really excellent beginning. I think that it's time that we go deeper in this conversation with our Buddhist brothers. And it's especially of relevance for Pakistan, given that we have this amazing heritage in Buddhist heritage in Pakistan. One needs to know that some of the major schools of Mahayana Buddhism took their origin in Gandhara, and a substantial part of Gandhara was in Pakistan. So that's what I'm doing at the moment. Hello?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very useful indeed.
Okay, so can I start the lecture now?
Yes, please.
Okay, perfect. So the title of the lecture is Imam Ali, the culture hero. And so this is the plan of the lecture. So I'll give a short introduction, and then I will ask the question of what is a culture hero. And then in the second part, I'll be talking about Imam Ali, the culture hero of Islamic civilization. And then I'll touch upon a very important point, which is the war on Ali and the war on traditional culture. So to introduce my subject, I think it's important to make a very clear distinction between, on the one hand, the historical character of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and on the other hand, the figure of Imam Ali. And I don't necessarily believe that the two are, that the two oppose each other, but one needs to understand that there is a difference. The figure of Imam Ali is, to put it shortly, it is what the tradition perceives, the collective tradition perceives about the character of Imam Ali, not only as a historical character, but also as the subject matter of mystical and philosophical speculations, as well as an ethical and cultural role model that transcends the historical character that is Imam Ali. So I think it's important to distinguish here what we're talking about. So although I don't believe there's an opposition, but at the same time, Imam Ali as a figure transcends the historical character that he was. There's a life beyond the grave, so to speak, when it comes to the idea of a figure. So what is also really important to keep in mind is that very early on, Imam Ali has been a vehicle of ideas and doctrines bridging antiquity and the Middle Ages. So there's a lot of material coming from Neoplatonism, Platonism, Jewish mysticism, mystical Christianity, and of course a variety of different Christian movements, as well as Zoroastrianism, that are able to enter the Islamic tradition and to be preserved within the body of knowledge of Islamic tradition through the figure of Imam Ali. So we find writings, especially hadith collections, where, for example, Imam Ali is seen as the interpreter par excellence of the Avesta of the Zoroastrian tradition, for example. So so from the start, we see that right from the beginning, the figure of Ali is seen really as this conduct through which ancient mystical and philosophical ideas were able to continue to be disseminated within the Islamic world. Regarding the historical character, I think there are two really important questions that have remained a mystery and are tied to the figure of Imam Ali that I'm talking about. First of all, his absence from the wars of conquest, and I'll touch upon it later on, and the fact that he's choosing Kufa as his capital. Now, Kufa was situated, first of all, Kufa was previously part of the Sasanian Iranian Empire. So it is a part of the world that is deeply influenced by Zoroastrianism, but also by Manichaeism as well, and Eastern Christianity, and different Gnostic movements that exist in the region. And one wonders whether the choice of the city of Kufa as its capital had to do with the fact that the historical Ali was looking to find a more receptive audience for his ideas. rather than the more tribal environment that was Medina. So these are questions that I'm leaving open for now. So we come to the first part of the lecture. So what is a culture hero? So the notion of the culture hero was introduced in 1905 by Kurt Breisig, using the German term Heilbringer. So it's the bringer of salvation. Another German term for the concept is Kulturbringer, the bringer of culture. And so another German scholar, Wilhelm Schmidt, identifies 5 types of culture heroes. So first of all, you have the hero who frees men from evil beings and protects them from dangers. He is to be found in epic literature. And we find this, this type of culture hero, for example, in the Ramayana, for example. It's the figure of Ram, for example. We also find it in the Shahnameh, the figure of Rostam, for example, or Firaydun, who vanquishes Zahak. So it's the idea that the hero fights the forces of chaos, be it monsters or natural disasters, and creates the conditions for order and civilization. Then the second type of cultural hero is the culture hero who teaches people various arts and inventions, writing, architecture, agriculture, fire, clothing, craftsmanship, and the arts. So if you're familiar, for example, with the Shahnameh, the first divine kings that appear in the beginning of the Shahnameh are people who teach, are characters or figures that teach people, that teach humanity the use of fire, the use of the use of cooking, as well as I don't know, trimming your beard and agriculture, writing, and so on and so forth. These are what the French would call the héros civilisationnels, civilizational heroes. And it's really the idea that contrary to what is believed nowadays, where we believe that human beings sort of went through a trial and error figure through which they developed the knowledge that would bring about civilization. Here, the idea is that civilization is something that is transmitted from above down, from the celestial realm, and is transmitted to humanity that way. Then thirdly, you have the great lawmaker who establishes the socio-political order, introduces social organization, laws and rules of cohabitation of spouses, families, clans, and tribes. So these are the lawgivers. And for example, Moses is probably, or Manu, are very good examples of the idea of the cultural hero as the lawmaker. Then fourthly, you have sages and prophets who set ethical and religious rules and introduce ceremonies and the sacred calendar. And for example, in China, that would be Confucius. Then the transformer who organizes the world and recreates and organizes the existing existing creatures. And it's really for example, the example of Adam, who is being taught the names of creation and then names the different creatures of creations, and that way organizes the world through naming. And so it's the classifier figure in terms of the figure of the cultural hero. Then we have the cultural hero as an intermediary between the divine and the human realms, and who acts as an arbiter between different types of creatures. So these are the common features of the culture hero. Some are found in some of these are found in so certain cultural heroes have all these characteristics, others don't. But in general, these seems to be the trends when it comes to cultural heroes. If I were to give an example, for example, Guru Nanak would be, and the Sikh Gurus would be seen as cultural heroes in a sense that, first of all, it's a person who brings a spiritual message. It's also a person who introduces a new alphabet and therefore also a new religious cycle. It's also someone, I mean, and his successors, of course, who create these sacred wells where people, gather for sacred pilgrimage. And then you have the figure of Guru Gobind Singh, who institutes the order of the Nirmalas, who were the teachers of the Sikhs, who were not Brahmins, but actually most of them were Jats, but who were teaching Sanskrit and the Vedic sciences to the Sikhs. And the idea was to give, even to the simple farmer, to give these people access to elite education. And if you look at the 19th century reports on the state of education in Punjab, written by Leitner, you find that shortly after the invasion of Punjab by the British, Punjabis had actually a formidable level of education where most people in Punjab knew between 2 or 3 languages. And to the point where, as you most probably know, in Lahore, there was French books were being published, such as, for example, Les Fables de La Fontaine, because there were people reading French in those days. And it's only with the British that the image of the Punjabi as a not educated person came about. The reports that we have from the 19th century show that it was a very different picture before the invasion of Punjab by the British. The regular Punjabis, even in villages, were actually quite educated people. So that's for the idea of the culture hero. Now, how does this apply to the figure of Imam Ali? Imam Ali is a figure that is, who after the Prophet is of primary importance for Islam, and we'll set aside here the doctrinal aspects, which is actually not really of importance here. Even if we were to take away the Shi'i and Sunni Sufi speculations about the figure of Imam Ali, Ali ibn Abi Talib still remains a crucial character in for Islamic civilization, because he is seen as a civilizational hero. So, for example, for this most sacred art that is calligraphy in Islamic tradition, he is seen as the founder of Islamic calligraphy. And there's general agreement on that. Most importantly, because he was the scribe of the Prophet. Whenever the Prophet had a revelation, it would be Imam Ali who would basically be writing down the revelation. And Imam Ali is credited traditionally with a very interesting detail that might seem absolutely unimportant, but which I actually believe is really important. There's a on the alif in certain styles of calligraphy, such as, for example, in Nasr or Thuluth, you find that the alif has a small hat, on top, and this small hat is actually credited to Imam Ali. Now, what's really interesting, whether that is historically the case or not is not relevant. It's not important here. But what is really important here is that Imam Ali is credited with this idea of adding something to the letter that that goes well beyond the simple notion of transferring meaning. So, so the alif with a hat on the top, it's an act of beautification, meaning that calligraphy isn't just about conveying meaning, but rather it is also about conveying beauty. It's about freeing the letter from its purely functional dimension. And this is where art begins. This is where art distinguishes itself from, purely, from things that are purely functional, right? Now, of course, Imam Ali is of capital importance for the Kufi script because, he's credited with a certain number of manuscripts that are attributed to him. There's a controversy, of course, as to whether or not they are from him. But in any case, these manuscripts are written in the Kufi script. And later on, during the Abbasid period with Ibn Muqla, you have the creation of the Naskh and Thuluth script. Now, what's really interesting is that Ibn Muqla was a vizier of the Abbasids. And we know very little about his sectarian affiliations. He was most probably not Shi'i. But it is said that he was taught the Naskh and the Thuluth script by Imam Ali in a dream. And that's really interesting because so there's this idea that spiritual teachings as well as civilizational teachings are transmitted through visionary dreams. And this gets repeated yet again later on in the 15th century with, the 14th century with Mirza Tabrizi, who was the creator of the Nastaliq script, and who himself, is said that he was taught the Nastaliq script by Imam Ali in a dream. And so we see that beyond the grave, Imam Ali as a mystical figure is also a creator of culture by bringing about these new scripts. And the creation of a new script is a fundamental act of a civilizational or a cultural hero. Now, the fact that Imam Ali is the scribe of the Prophet and, of course, the father of Islamic Arabo-Persian calligraphy is also tied intimately to hermeneutics. We have the Hadith of Thaqalain, where the Prophet ﷺ said, I leave behind two weighty things, the Quran and Ma Ahlul Bayt, Ma Ahlul Bayt, Ma Ahlul Bayt. And this is a hadith that is common to both Sunni and Shi'i sources. Now, the idea is that the Quran cannot be interpreted without the Ahlul Bayt. Now, beyond the mystical considerations of this hadith, there's also a very practical one, which is that at the time of the Prophet, at the time of Imam Ali, the Arabic script did not have dots that would enable one to differentiate, for example, a ba from a ta, for example. So Imam Ali was literally the one person who was able to read the Quran as it was, because he knew what basically which letter was a ba or a ta, and so on and so forth. As we know, it's only later on with the influence of Syriac that the diacritic signs were introduced into the Arabic script. Then there's later on, of course, mystical considerations. There's a famous saying that is attributed to Imam Ali, where he says, "Ana nuqta taht al-ba." I'm the dots underneath the ba. And there's a whole range of mystical considerations regarding this hadith, or this saying that we find in both Sunni Sufi sources as well as Shi'i sources. And it's really the idea that Ali is as the representative of the esoteric dimension of Islam, is the one who gives through which the true meaning of the Islamic tradition is actually known. So without the dot under the ba just remains a horizontal line that has no meaning. And the idea is that without the esoteric tradition, without the esoteric aspect of Islam, Islam just remains a how to put it, a collection of dead practices and beliefs without any real depth. There's also the idea in certain hadith that Imam Ali is the cosmic qalam that is referred to in the Quran. And this, of course, refers to the idea of Ali as a theophanic being, as the face of God, as the Wajhullah, which basically in the Christian tradition we call the Logos. It's the idea that God writes the world into existence through the Logos, and Ali is the manifestation of the Logos. And so it's the idea of Imam Ali as the Logos, and the idea of the Logos here is represented by the idea of the Qalam. Now, this is a personal speculation that I'm going to bring about here, but there seems to be, both in the Christian tradition and in mystical Islam, and especially in Shiism, mystical Shiism, the idea that the Logos is intimately linked to the idea of sacrifice, meaning that in order for the Logos to bring about order, to organize existence, the Logos also needs to undergo sacrifice. And for the Christians, that's of course, the death of Christ on the cross. Now, what's really interesting is here that the qalam is a reed that is cut in order to and I'm always speculating about the idea that Karbala is the maqta, the place where the cosmic qalam was cut in order to actually fulfill its function as a cosmic redeemer, very simply because of the idea that of Imam Hussein as a universal intercessor, who is the Safina al-Najat, the Ark of Salvation that God has provided humanity, given that the imperialistic Islam had taken over and perverted the original spiritual message of the Prophet. And it's the idea that through the intercession of Imam Hussein, people of all backgrounds, Sunni or Shia or even Christians or even non-Muslims, may find a vehicle of salvation. We should always remember that many of the Shuhada in Karbala were not Shias, and actually two of them, Abu Wahab al-Kalbi was actually a Christian. Him and his wife actually died in Karbala as martyrs. So it's so that I'm just throwing this idea there. But there's this profound link between calligraphy and spirituality. There's this beautiful idea that the black ink represents really our trials and our despair and our suffering, and that the duty of the calligrapher is to use that to write light into existence. So contrary to much of the victimhood mentality that dominates much of the Muslim world nowadays, where people focus on exterior enemies and moan continuously about the present day of the world, so on and so forth. Calligraphy teaches us to basically take the suffering in our lives and to sublimate it and to transform it into an act of beauty and to write light into our existence. And it's a beautiful teaching. And of course, if people were actually taught calligraphy properly in as it should be in primary and secondary school education, maybe it would help get rid of this paralyzing disease that is this victimhood narrative that we unfortunately got from Marxism. Now, there's a very beautiful poem that was written by Fazlullah Astarabadi, who was the founder of the Hurufi movement. And the Hurufi movement, as you probably know, had a huge impact in the Mughal Empire. And he writes the following: موصوف صفات قل هو الله علی است، در عالم معرفت شهنشاه علی است، آن نقطه کل که جز از او پیدا شد و لاک آن علی است بالله علی است. The one who is described by the Quranic expression, say he is God, is Ali. Ali is the supreme king in the world of cognizance, this universal dot from which are originated all particular beings. By God it is Ali, by God it is Ali. Now, beyond calligraphy, there are of course other areas of Islamic civilization that are intimately tied to the personality of the figure of Imam Ali, and that's in particular the notion of futuwa or Javan Mardi. Imam Ali is the primordial knight. There's the famous formula known as the Jibrailiyah that says, La fata ila Ali, la sayf ila dhul faqar. There's no knight but Ali, and there's no sword but the dhul faqar. By the way, the dhul faqar, incidentally, was most probably not a curved sword, and was not used in the way that it's shown in the Message movie. It's a myth. Curved swords only start appearing in the Muslim world with the Seljuks. Until then, the swords were actually straight. Most probably the Dhul Faqar was in Arabic, Dhul Faqar means the one with a spine. Probably has to do with the fact that Imam Ali used to fight without a shield very often, and that he would use a straight sword, and that he would use one side to counter the strikes by the enemies, and this would basically dent the blade, which would give it the appearance of a spine, and then he would use the other side of the blade to actually cut. So that's an explanation that I think is quite rational. So futuwa comes from the Arabic root fataya, which means to be young or excel in virile virtues, and these virile virtues are courage, generosity, magnanimity, control over one's libido, and so on and so forth. So, and it's the Persian equivalent is Javan Mardi. And it's a very ancient idea. It's Javan Mardi is something that really takes, as a phenomenon, takes its root in Zoroastrian Iran. And there's some suggestion in the Futuwa literature that the culture of Mecca was deeply influenced by these Futuwa rituals, and that the prophets did partake in these rituals. And Salman was actually a very important figure in the continuation of this influence in early Islam. So, what is Futuwa? Well, first of all, it's a chivalric code of honor that is very similar to the Japanese Bushido, but it's tied to Islamic spirituality. You have this really interesting writing on Futuwa called the Fotovatname Sultani by the Naqshbandi author Kashifi, and who gives the codes of conduct of Futuwa and deeply links Futuwa to martial arts. And as you know, the Sunnah sports are deeply tied to the chivalric lifestyle. So a Muslim is supposed to engage in swordsmanship, archery. There's a hadith that says that the one who does not practice archery is not from me. It's a prophetic hadith. Horse riding, wrestling, swimming. And it's really sad to see how all of this is being extremely neglected in the Muslim world to the point of almost disappearing. And to see Muslims adopt really silly sports whereby human beings are being conditioned into running after a ball like dogs. This is a personal reflection of mine. When one knows that the angels pray behind us when we're conducting salah, and that God loves humanity so much that he puts these angels at the service of humanity, to see human beings running after a ball like a vulgar dog it's profoundly, I find the idea profoundly hurtful. It's because it's very demeaning to the dignity of the human being. And the Islamic tradition has always endeavored to raise the status of the human being. And one of the idea, especially for young men, it's the idea that, you know, all of these sports teach you essential, ethical teachings. Horse riding is seen as a metaphor for the nafs. For example, the horse here representing the nafs. You're not supposed to fight the nafs, but you're not supposed to overindulge the nafs either. Archery helps with concentration. Swordsmanship teaches you the value of life. I was very fortunate to actually learn the traditional Sikh battle arts with swords under a one of the last teachers of this art in the Sikh community. When you're training with real swords, and you get to appreciate the value of human life and the huge responsibility that that you're holding in your hands. And it's really a shame that these things have disappeared in the Muslim world. It's truly shameful. The other dimension of Futuha is, of course, the network of guilds and corporations of craftsmen regulated by an ethical code of honor tied to Islamic spirituality. And this is one of the hallmarks of Islamic civilization. It's the idea that the bazaar, and especially the culture of the craftsman, was spiritualized because it was tied to the Sufi orders. And to give you an example, we have futuwat, so we have documents of futuwa that explain, for example, how calico printers, when they're printing the pattern on the cloth, need to constantly remind themselves that the white cloth needs to be a reflection of the purity of your hearts, and that the pattern that you're printing on the white cloth is a representation of the name of God. And you're supposed to work, right, whilst doing dhikr. Or, for example, you have these amazing swordsmiths in Damascus who, when they're beating the steel in order to shape into its sword, are doing dhikr, and actually doing the dhikr of the Jibra'iliyah. La fata ila Ali la sayf ila dhul faqar. And the most important fact here is that Futuwa culture was the one thing that transcended the sectarian divides between Sunni and Shias. One of the last great Abbasid caliphs, Nasruddin Allah, had really elevated the institution of Futuwa to bridge the gap between Sunni and Shias. And this is a point I'm going to make later on, which is that when people lose the common culture that held them together for centuries, the only thing that is left as an identity marker becomes their sectarian affiliation. And this is where trouble starts. And of course, there's the other dimension of Imam Ali, his profound bond with poetry and literature in general. We have a diwan of poetry that is attributed to Imam Ali with really wonderful poetry. And of course, there's the Nahj al-Balagha, which is a masterpiece of rhetoric. And here again, we find this idea that language needs to be transcended from its purely functional dimension. And what is literature, or what is a literary work? A literary work is an art. It's a piece of, well, it's an artistic masterpiece made of words. And again, it's the idea that beyond the purely functional dimension of language, there's also language is sort of salvaged from its purely functional dimension through beauty. And that we as human beings, we're actually at our very core, we're spiritual beings who need beauty just as much as we need air, right? And therefore, the figure of Ali is extremely important in the sense that he is the patron saint of poets and the people of the letters, of the Ahl al-Qalam, against the puritanical tendencies that have always been extremely critical of poetry. But you have these sort of puritanical tendencies that come up, time and time again in Islamic history, who are extremely, let's say, critical, if not even hostile, to not just poetry, but just any form of art. I forgot to mention this in the slides, but even when it comes to music, there's a very important group of people in Kurdistan known as the Ahl Haq. They're seen as extreme Shiites. So when I say extreme Shiites, that has nothing to do with politics, but they're people who don't pray according to the commonly held jurisprudence that is in vigor in Sunni or Shia Islam. Their ritual consists, just like the Turkish Alevis, in the use of the tanbur, which is a stringed instrument, and in the singing of sacred hymns. And again, here there's always, especially in Alevism and the Ahl Haq, there's this profound relationship between Imam Ali and music, right? And so in a sense, the figure of Ali becomes a patron saint and protector of musicians, because the influence of the Ahl Haq has gone way beyond just their own community. They've had a tremendous importance, a tremendous influence on the Khaksar dervishes in Iran, but also the Nimatulaiya order. One should just remember Mushtaq Ali Shah, who was, was sentenced to death by the Shi'i jurist Bihbihani because he was playing music while the adhan was going on. So, just to say that the jurists don't have a monopoly on the personality of Imam Ali. Imam Ali has been until today a very important figure for the preservation of Persian music and poetry. There's another dimension as well, which is Ali the farmer, which a lot of people forget. Whilst the wars of conquest went on, Imam Ali actually was digging wells and occupying himself with agriculture. And it's really the emphasis on the nobility of manual labor, right? And all of this brings us to the idea that Imam Ali is a representation of the Insan Kamil. So I represented it here with with a diagram. So you have these 5 dimensions that are represented by different objects. So you have the masbaha above that represents spirituality. But then you have the qalam, which represents the humanities, so the arts, as well as the rest of the humanities, literature, music, painting, architecture, and so on and so forth. You have the sword, which of course represents chivalry. You have the hammer, which represents the crafts, and of course you have the sorry, the sickle, which represents, agriculture. And these 5, at the intersection of all these 5 fundamental aspects of Islamic civilization, you have the figure of Ali as a patron saint of all these 5, because when it comes to spirituality, Imam Ali is at the very center of the chains of transmission of the different Sufi orders. They all go back to Imam Ali, except for, I think, the Naqshbandiya, and even then, there's still a link with the Ahl Bayt. For calligraphy and other arts, Imam Ali is also seen as a foundational figure. When it comes to chivalry, Imam Ali is seen as the patron saint of chivalry and of the Islamic martial arts. Sorry. And when it comes to the guilds of craftsmen, again, Ali is the patron saint because the codes of honor of the guilds go back to him. So this is a really central figure which transcends the sectarian divides within Islam. And now I come to an aspect of the discussion that I think is really important, which is the following one, and which deals with, of course, the questions that I've asked earlier on regarding the historical Ali. Why is it that Ali was not involved in the wars of conquest? And why is it that he chose Kufa as his capital? And there is a profound link, a profound bond between Imam Ali and eternal Iran, Iran-e Javedan. By Iran-e Javedan, I don't mean here, this is not a reference to present-day Iran, but Iranian civilization, which far transcends the historical boundaries of present-day Iran. It includes, of course, the areas that were dominated by the Sasanian and Achaemenid Empire, much of Central Asia, much of course, Tajikistan and the Persianate world, which of course also includes, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And of course, the civilizational values that go with it. This link, the profound link between Imam Ali and eternal Iran, was explored very recently by a really great work by this academic Mohsen Zakeri, who wrote this book titled Sassanid Soldiers in Early Muslim Society, The Origins of Ayaran and Futuwa. And here and there you find historical evidence that clearly shows this bond between Imam Ali and then the young community of Iranian converts to Islam, who came mostly from these from the army. One should remember that, for example, the Sasanian regiments of Yemen converted to Islam very early on, and there seems to always have been this profound bond between Imam Ali and these Iranians. And that has to do with, I think, the fact that the Bani Hashim, and especially the Prophet Imam Ali, were people who had a very cosmopolitan culture. We know that the Prophet had, used to wear clothes from different cultures, not just from the Hijaz. We also know that there was this idea of transcending the tribal codes of that, that were regulating life in Arabia at that time. And very early on, we see this conflict between, on the one hand, this Iranian type of Islam that exists within the Bani Hashim, that seeks to be universal, that puts a certain emphasis on, for example, monogamy as a foundational aspect for the creation of high culture. And this has been very well proven by Unwin in his famous book, Sex and Culture. High culture can only be produced when there's an emphasis on monogamy, marital fidelity, and the control of one's libido. And of course, which puts basically the nuclear family at the very core, as a very core element of society. This contrasts with a tribalist view of Islam that allows the continuation of the tribalist culture of the Hijaz, where the foundational unit of society is not the family, but the tribe, right? And within that context, then, ideas like marital, like monogamy become absolutely obsolete. And then you can clearly see the difference between these two tendencies when you look at the intellectual production, of the Umayyads, and contrast it with the Abbasids. The Abbasids, who were not Shi'is but were extremely influenced by Iranian culture, were really the ones that created what we nowadays know as Islamic civilization. They're the ones who create Beit al-Hikmah. They're the ones who bring all of these scholars from all around the world, Greeks, Indians, Buddhists, and so on and so forth, and gather them at the Beit al-Hikmah. They're the ones who start the whole translation process. It's a very cosmopolitan view of Islam, precisely because there's an attempt to get rid of this tribalistic mentality that used to be that was dominating the previous dynasty. And so we have this contrast between, on the one hand, the inclusion of non-Islamic heritage versus this exclusivistic jurisprudence that still reveals a certain tribalistic mentality. And if you live, for example, I live in Iraq, and there's a profound link between the clergy and the tribes. The tribes, the clergy makes sure that the tribes basically keep their lifestyle, which of course means that the basic units of society is not the family, the nuclear family, but still is the tribe. And it's really it's much harder to produce high culture in that type of context versus a context where the individual is freed from the boundaries of tribal mentality, and there's a more emphasis on the family unit as a foundational element of society. Now, if we look nowadays, there's with the advent of modernity in the Muslim world, and the emergence of different movements, be it the secular types or the so-called revivalist types, there is this common trait, which is this war on traditional arts, traditional architecture, traditional music, and so on and so forth. And we can clearly see that in for example, in Pakistan, where we're on the brink of losing our classical Hindustani Sangeet tradition. It's very hard. I practice music myself. It's very difficult to find people who still build traditional instruments. Beyond sitar, it's almost impossible to find people who can still build a dilruba or a tar shanai or a sarod, and so on and so forth. Because on the one hand, you have two forces that apparently oppose each other. On the one hand, you have these puritanical revivalist movements that say that music is haram, and then you have the armies of the Salman Ahmeds of this world, who basically have introduced pop culture in Pakistan, and so the classical musicians are found stuck between two forces that, you know, that whilst opposing each other are actually destroying the people that are actually in the middle, which is traditional musicians. Now, all of this has, of course, and of course, this phenomenon runs parallel to the diminishing role that Ali has had as a cultural reference in the lives of people. And this, we can see this in the 80s when you know, Saudi Arabia started to have a more important role in the political life of Pakistan. And of course, Iran basically created its own version of Islamic socialism and transformed Imam Ali from being a mystical figure into an Islamic Che Guevara, which is just as bad as, you know, hating him, really. So you have this diminished role of Imam Ali in the lives of average people, and so what happens is that because I think there's a profound link between the two, is that when Ali starts becoming less and less important in the lives of both Sunnis and Shias in any given society, it's also the poets, the musicians, the architects, the calligraphers that are also losing their status in society. And of course, the destruction of the arts, the destruction of the arts, the promotion of anti-social trends, and the dissolution of traditional society and family, all of this serves the interests of neoliberalism and globalism. One only has to see the destruction of traditional architecture in Mecca and these horrific, you know, Mordor type of buildings, and this horrible, you know, Tower of Sauron that was built just next to the sacred Haram, to understand that far from actually opposing each other, secular globalism and this pseudo revivalist trends in Islam all serve neoliberalism, modernity, and globalism at the expense of traditional culture, which has always given workers and farmers and calligraphers and artists their dignity. And with the loss of traditional culture, you have the increase of sectarianism. When people are no longer bound by a common culture, identity revolves and is recentered around other markers. Here in Iraq, for example, you have a real culture war where you will not be able to enter buildings if you're dressed in a traditional dishdasha. These are the long garments that men wear traditionally, and if you're wearing the traditional headgear, you'll be barred from certain places here in Iraq. And what does it mean? It's the idea that, well, we're going to adopt Western clothes and Western architecture and so on and so forth. So we're going to destroy, you know, the classical culture that used to bind people together. Well, when you do that, then people will recreate their identity by, you know, recentering themselves or recentering the identity around, for example, sectarian markers. And then suddenly, you know, being a Sunni or being a Shia becomes, you know, way more important than it was, for example, 100 years ago. For example, people are very shocked when I say this, but the Shias of Baghdad have a very inclusive culture. A lot of Shias here in Baghdad have as a first name Omar, for example, which would be unthinkable, for example, in Iran or Pakistan, for example. In my own family here, we have cousins called Saddam, and they're Shia. And why is that? Because before the advent of sectarianism in Iraq, people still had a common culture which transcended sectarian divides. In fact, people used to joke about these sectarian divides, you know, around shisha and around, you know, a few cups of good Iraqi chai, right? It doesn't mean people were secular the way that we understand it today. No, people would pray, they would go to ziyarah, they would, but there was this common culture of calligraphers, musicians, architects that kept people together. When that is lost, then that's where sectarianism, you know, gains a foothold in society. And the central figure for traditional culture in the Islamic world has always been the personality of Imam Ali. And of course, what I've just said about Iraq is equally, you know, valid for Pakistan. And we should be extremely careful and cautious about the way in which this new generation of young people in Pakistan are adopting not just the clothing of, you know, people who used to, you know, colonize us, but also new ideologies, such as the woke type of ideologies that are extremely dangerous and are and it's really, I mean, I used to teach a course called Islamic Aesthetics. And I was always, my students were always shocked by the fact that, you know, there was this entire heritage that they were not made aware of because the education systems simply refused to allow them to partake in this heritage. And, you know, it's a horrible sin to deprive young generations from their rightful inheritance. And my last point here is that, you know, in relationship to eternal Iran, I'm one of these people who was deeply convinced of the fact that Persian should have been one of the national languages of Pakistan, because first of all, it's always been the case. It's been the main cultural language for centuries. And I'm going to leave this as an open question. I wonder what type of society we would have if our children in primary and secondary schools were taught Hafiz, Rumi, Omar Khayyam, Jami, Saadi, and Ferdowsi instead of, you know, Ibn Taymiyyah and Maududi and other types like that. What kind of society would we have? And I think that it's really time that we put pressure on having these authors who were also saints, were also awliya, as part of the curriculum. Because there's one profound dimension that people seem to forget, which is that Pakistan, at the end of the day, is the Bagh awliya, is the garden of the saints. It was saints who mostly came from the Persian world, who brought tasawwuf and this beautiful, loving Islam that used to be the traditional Islam of people in Pakistan. And pressure needs to be put on the authorities to not only bring those teachings back, but also the language that, you know, used to vehiculate those teachings. I hope I haven't bored anyone. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. I get sort of confused whether to call you Yusuf or to call you Fransisco.
Well, you know, just like the devil, I'm known by many names. So
but in either case, it was a most refreshing, and I think it must have struck a chord with all of our listeners as well. So yes, we should open the floor for any questions or comments. You can. Maybe, I think you're still sharing your screen. If you could turn off the screen sharing. Yeah, I can do that. Bilal, sir, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Tamur Saab. And thank you for a wonderful presentation, which was so eclectic, but you managed to kind of harmonize all the different strands in a beautiful way. I have many questions, but I want to leave time and space for others as well. So I'll just ask one question for the moment. And incidentally, I'm very familiar with the Sikh martial arts group that I think you studied with, who revived the classical Sikh martial tradition.
Nadar Singh, right?
That's right, yes.
Yeah. Excellent.
And just on that topic of the martial tradition and swords as well, and the topic of Zulfiqar, because I remember one of my Arabic teachers making the same distinction that Zulfiqar is more of a mythology, and even etymologically, the two don't chime together in terms of what's been passed down to us by its understanding. But you said that the curved swords came later, they only had straight swords. But I've read that Imam Ali alayhi salam praised and eulogized the curved Indian sword. So is there not a possibility that even in his time, the curved Indian sword had come to the Arabian Peninsula, and at the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they were using them?
Well, the sources say that the Dhulfiqar was a Roman sword. That's what that's what basically the sources say. So we know from that it must have been a straight sword. There's a specialist of Islamic and Iranian arms and armor by the name of Mushtari Khorasani. He wrote an encyclopedia of Iranian arms and armor, and he went into depth into the research on the Dhulfiqar. He spent months in the library of Astana Quds Razavi in Mashhad, studying every single possible work on the Dhulfiqar. And his conclusion is that it was straight sword. And the reason why it's called Dhulfiqar is because Imam Ali usually fought without a shield, just like the samurais. And that in his fighting technique consisted in blocking the blows of the adversary with one side of the blade, and then use the other side to basically cut. That's what his conclusion is, and he's both an academic and a trained martial artist. Actually, he's started this. He basically is reviving the ancient Iranian martial arts from the Safavid period, which of course is also relevant for the Mughal period as well. An amazing scholar, someone who really goes into depth. So I would really encourage you to look into his work because it's quite remarkable. And he's also giving classes, and and much of what I've experienced with Ustad Nadar Singh is I've also seen it with Dr. Mushtaq Rahsani. So hopefully, I dream of a day when we can invite both Nadar Singh and Khorasani to Pakistan, so that we can really start a revival of these martial arts in Pakistan. Not just for boys, though. I think girls should also learn them as well. It's quite it's a fascinating world.
Yeah, sorry, not to labor the point. It wasn't so much about Zulfiqar itself, because we see from the Topkapi Museum and some of the armaments left over from as early as we do have, that they're not so much curved swords, but it's just I'm just entertaining the possibility of curved swords having been there at the time of Imam Ali. And sorry.
Yeah, the curved swords that exist at that time in India are the kukri types that we find in Nepal. So they're bent forward. And so the ones that are bent, like for example the Persian swords, these come much later on in India. these do not exist in pre-Islamic India. So the swords that the traditional Indian swords that we find around that time are, for example, the khanda, which is a straight double-edged sword. We also find the swords that are bent forward, like the kukri, for example, and these are used for specific types of moves within Shastra Vidya, within the traditional battle arts of India. So it might be that some of these swords found their way into the Hijaz, because the world, the Hijaz and India were actually quite well connected even in those days. But I don't know. I've not found any evidence going in that direction.
Thank you very much.
I'll if you could type the name of that person in the chat, then I can hopefully follow up on some leads there. Thank you very much again for your presentation.
Yeah, I just have to find out how to. Yeah, let me. Oh yeah, so let me write it down right now. Iranian arms and armor. Right. Yes, so you have it.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Somebody's asking, Rayan Habib is asking that he has a question. Could you kindly elaborate upon some of the musical aspects associated with Hazrat Ali's teachings, alongside both the Turkish and Tajikistani? I think you said Kurdish, I think. But anyway, he's asking alongside both the Turkish and traditions of prayer.
Yeah, so these two groups are actually seem to be quite they're very similar. So the Ali Haq from Iranian Kurdistan, they seem to have been founded around the 14th century, pretty much like the Turkish Alevism. There's actually speculations that the founder of the Al Haq tradition and the founder of the Alevi tradition were actually one and the same person. So the founder of the Al Haq tradition was Sultan Saha, who was a descendant of Imam Rida alayhi salam, and the founder of the Alevi tradition, one of the possible founders of the Alevi tradition was Haj Ali Bektash Veli, was also a descendant of Imam Rida. And what's really interesting is that these are groups that usually gather on Thursday nights for a ritual called the Jam, or in Turkish Jem, whereby they so one becomes part of the community through an initiation process. For the Ahle Haq, it's called Ser Sepordan, the giving your head. And so you give your head, and this is how you become part of the community. And the hymns that are sung by the community are played on an instrument called a tanbur, which is only used for sacred music. So you're not allowed to you use a tanbur to sing love songs for your girlfriend or something like that. That's completely out of order. And so the tanbur itself has its own symbolism, in a sense that the tanbur has 14 frets, which represents the 14 Masumin. And there are 72 secret maqams, so musical scales, that are used by the Ali Haq, and that can never be played outside of the jam or to people who are not part of the Ali Haq tradition. Except for, sometimes you have a lucky person like me, you have a glimpse of that. And what happens in these, in the Ahl Haq tradition, what happens is that these maqams are used to, for example, heal people from physical ailments, or to invite angels. So what happens is that the angels possess a person and start to make utterances, either predicting the future or revealing certain truth. So for example, what's really interesting, Shah Ismail Safavi is very often accused of having claimed that he was Imam Mahdi or Imam Ali, and so on and so forth. But I spoke about it to my Ali Haq friends, and it's like, no, that's not what it is. What it is that he most probably went into a state of trance, where during which the spirit of Ali or the spirit of Imam Mahdi spoke through him. And so when that's their explanation, I'm like, I abstain from saying whether it is true or not. That's not my function here as an academic. But so you have that in the Ali Haq tradition. The Turkish Alevis have very similar rituals. Unfortunately, due to historical circumstances, they've been very much the left has pretty much taken over the movement, and they've done a lot of reforms whereby the traditional much of the traditional teachings are no longer transmitted, because they have a committee system that elects the heads of the community instead of the masters nominating their successors. In any case, again, you have the community that comes together, and community issues are solved within the gathering, and then you have these sacred hymns that are being sung, and many of these hymns are absolutely beautiful, like absolutely wonderful poetry that is recited there. Much of it is attributed actually to Shah Ismail Safavi, amongst many others, and yeah, and the instrument is seen as almost sacred, although the Turkish Alevis also use the saz, which is the instrument that they use, or the bahlama, for other non-sacred uses as well. But yeah, the bahlama in Turkey is always associated with Turkish Alevism. Yes.
Thank you very much, Ustaz Yusuf. I think because the time, considering that, is there a movie about tambour? I wish I could learn one day to play it. Inshallah, I'm sure you can research it on the web, more about the instrument.
Well, there's material, but it's mostly in Persian. I've not seen any material that is not in Persian regarding tanbur. Yeah, but tanbur is actually quite affordable. It costs between $100 and $200 for a tanbur. But the problem is, being able to learn, because there's a specific right hand technique that goes with the tanbur, which is really difficult, and it's not something one can learn on YouTube, unfortunately.
I would just like to thank you again, and
welcome.
To sort of strike a chord with myself was how no religion or no civilization can really function properly without its spirit.
Yeah.
And some of our teachers have said that it is the Barakah Muhammadiyah which animates Islamic civilization. And the carrier of the Barakah Muhammadiyah are the Sufi Turuk, and the head of the Sufi Turuk, Imam Ali. So looking from that perspective, as Imam Ali representing the spirit of Islam, that was reiterated by your beautiful talk. And I hope we can continue this conversation further. That's what one would hope for, really. Thank you once again.
Yes, absolutely. Well, hopefully I'll be moving to Pakistan, inshallah, soon. So I can finally be a proper Punjabi.
Look forward to that. And thank you for all the participants. Once again, Khuda Hafiz. Ma salama.
Masalam.
Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. Thank you.
Allah Hafiz, sir. Thank you.